I'm Bruno Pedreira, Senior Director and also UT Extension Forage Specialist. And I'm joined here today with Dr. Katie Mason, our UT Extension Beef Cattle Specialist. How are you doing today, Dr. Mason?
Yeah, doing good. Excited to be here and excited to hear from Dr. Hancock.
That's amazing. I think that's our goal for today. I'm fantastic today, and very excited to welcome here Dr. Dennis Hancock, Director for the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center with the USDA. And Dennis, thanks so much for taking time to come to Tennessee. Have you here in Tennessee is amazing. I want to start this podcast at asking you to share a little bit about your story, your personal and professional journey that brought you here.
Sure. Well, I grew up on a beef cattle farm in Western Kentucky, not too far away from here actually, and my front pasture was my playground, so that was our backyard, was our front pasture. So I've been in the forage industry, in the forage world, since I was knee high to a grasshopper, as they say. So from there, I went to a little college called Berea College, which is in eastern Kentucky, and had the great opportunity to work my way through school while I was there, and was in the animal nutrition lab while I was there, and learned a lot about ruminant nutrition as well as other animals, and was able to go to graduate school at the University of Kentucky, completed both a master's and eventually a PhD there as well. Incidentally, served for a couple, 2.5 years as a county extension agent in northern Kentucky. And then after I finished my PhD, working full time and going to school part time, I was able to go to the University of Georgia for a few years as their forage extension specialist. So I was there not quite 14 years, and then I got a call from Madison, Wisconsin, saying, "We'd really like for you to come throw your hat in the ring for this position as center director at the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center." And for those in the business, the Dairy Forage Research Center really is one of the, it's really well outfitted to do the type of work that we do, particularly in service to the dairy industry, similar to the way that you all are set up to do that for the beef industry here. And it was a great opportunity, and I really looked forward to that opportunity, and have been there for almost 5 years now.
Oh, that much, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, time flies, right?
It definitely flies.
Yeah, so it's always great to hear about folks' background. I won't go into my whole story, but a farm visit with you during an internship that I did at UGA was very pivotal in my career trajectory. So always appreciate, reminiscing on those things. But
Well,
yeah, yeah. So to kind of get to our topic today, we want to talk to you about a survey that was done a few years ago. I think through AFGC maybe was a partner in helping get that distributed, and looking at efficient economic forage practices, right? So trying to kind of figure out what things should producers be doing that are returning money to the farm, what are some things that are maybe costing them. And so we want to go through the top information from that survey, but give us a little bit of background and then we'll jump into that.
yeah, so the survey was really put together by a group of us that are affiliated with AFGC, and the idea was to try to really get at some of the practices that really pay for themselves. We talked a lot about management different things that we can do to improve productivity and profitability, but what are really those things that are must-haves that are going to really make the difference in profitability? And so we sent out a survey. It went out to 2,600 plus people. We had, I think, somewhere around 17% return rate. About half of those were producers. The other, I think there was about 20% or so that were public sector folks, and then the others were industry sector folks. So good representation across the whole of the U.S. And they basically ended up with 10 key, at the top of that line, there were 10 key forage practices that really pay for themselves. And I should say that for the purposes of what we're talking about here today, I've really focused in on the area of what I always referred to as the Upper South, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, over to Arkansas, a state or so around that, but that broad area across the midsection of the U.S. is really what we were focusing on, their survey results here. So I put together that talk a few years ago for AFGC just to share that information, and it's become pretty popular because it's a lot of good guidance that came out of that. And so the top 10, if I can read them off real quick for you,
Sure.
and we can talk about which ones we want to go down that rabbit hole with.
Mhm.
But the number 10, I'm going to channel my inner Dave Letterman, do the top 10 list here. Number 10 was the better establishment techniques or tools, so ways of better improving our establishment methodology. Number 9 was improved weed control. Number 8, I'm on now, better hay storage methods.
Mhm.
Number 7 was improved clover varieties, or adding in improved clover varieties. Number 6 was fall fertilization of pastures and hay fields. Number 5 was correcting soil pH. Number 4 was rotational grazing or rotational stocking. And number 3 was stockpiling forage for later grazing. Number 2 was soil testing. And number 1 out of all of those was extending the grazing season and feeding less hay. And I think we all have talked about that as major areas of focus over the years, especially the feeding less hay. But it's good to see how that really came out, not only for the producers rated that very, very high, but also the private and public sector rated that very, very high as
Yeah,
well. So,
and let's jump straight into this, Dennis, because here in Tennessee, we got a survey out a few years ago as well. And the numbers that we found out was that in Tennessee, on average, we are using hay for 143 days. Okay?
yes.
I used to tell my producer here that we are not in Wisconsin, right?
Right.
It's still Tennessee. I think we can extend this grazing season a little bit more. So what are your thoughts on this extended grazing season? You already mentioned stockpile as well, right? I think those are techniques that practices that we have been discussing here that we could put together. And instead of feeding hay for 140 days, which will mean almost 5 months of the year, right? We could push it to little small window.
Yeah. Several years ago, there was a study done of the M states, Mississippi, Missouri, and Michigan.
Okay.
All right. They left out Minnesota, but Michigan will be a good analogy to it. Mississippi fed somewhere around 140 days out of the year. Missouri fed about 140 days out of the year. In Michigan, they fed about 140 days out of the year. It's really strange. And even though that we have such dramatic differences in our grazing season and the length of that grazing season, there's definitely this tendency to feed a lot of hay. And when we think about how expensive that stuff is and how much time it takes to make it, it's definitely a big cost driver for things. And that's where stockpiling really comes into play too. So in talking about extending the grazing season, there's certainly some winter annuals that we can plant and things like that. But stockpiling forages, stockpiling our perennial cool season grasses in particular, for later grazing really is a key part of that whole thing. I just wanted to kind of hit on a couple high points from the talk that come out, and one of the things that we don't often think about also is planting annuals that really complement our perennials.
That's a great point.
We were, chit-chatting earlier about folks who are trying to plant some ryegrass, for example, into their tall fescue. Those are not very complementary. They're going to be trying to grow at a very similar time. Your winter annuals really need to be either, following a crop or something like that, or maybe it's in your Bermuda grass pasture. Your common Bermuda grass pasture is a great place to interseed some annuals. In particular, annual ryegrass is just one of the best. Another one that folks don't really think too much about, but there's a vast resource out there, is grazing crop residues. Grazing corn stover, in certain areas where cotton production is heavy. You can graze one cow on 1 acre for about 30 to 45 days on corn stover or cotton residue, often with very little challenges in terms of you got quite a bit of material out there, quite a bit of forage, and quite a bit of quality. And of course, you have to watch for herbicide residuals and
Sure.
restrictions
Mhm.
associated with that. But there's some real opportunities there. But stockpiling is really one of the best strategies for doing that. It saves you a lot in terms of labor, in terms of grazing management and the impacts of that on the health of the stand afterwards.
Mhm.
Certainly, there are some challenges in terms of some species are really well suited for stockpiling, but not others. Um, Orchard grass, for example, is you can, but it's not
Not,
not
yeah,
gonna hold with
not
you
like
like
fescue.
tall fescue would.
Right.
So,
But we are in the middle of the fescue belt here, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
We can capitalize on that. I have just a quick question
Sure.
about that. One of the challenges that we hear, and one of the answers that I wish I had for people was, how do I make the decision, to apply fertilizer to stockpile when it's dry? Or looking at the weather outlook.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and a number of folks have over the years tried to look at response rates of nitrogen. And my take on this is that if you have a really good healthy soil and you have been attentive to forage fertility and your fertilizer and lime, very importantly lime, um, it's very likely you won't see much of a nitrogen response.
Right.
Actually, some work that Alan Franzlebers is doing at NC State, associated with the USDA ARS. He is actually finding that a good healthy soil in terms of biological activity and that nutrient cycling turning over. In tall fescue, you really don't need a tremendous amount. It is advisable though, most states do recommend up to about 50 or 60 units of nitrogen. But in general, following a dry spell, you actually get enough nitrogen mineralization, you probably wouldn't see a great benefit. Where you would see a big benefit most likely would be is if the summer has been very wet and
Okay.
you've had a lot of cooler conditions as well, and it's grown a lot, used a lot of the nitrogen that's there or leached out some of the nitrogen that was there.
Sure.
And then you're more likely to see a response. But the big thing is stockpiling is not just they didn't eat it the first time and I'm going to let them come back in and try to eat it the second time. If they didn't eat it the first time, they're not going to eat it the second time.
Right.
You gotta start back and reset that crop and trim it back or graze it back to about 3 inches or so to let it regrow from that. So you got good fresh growth on it.
Yeah, that's the kind of recommendation we have on the standard here for Tennessee. Mow it out, bring your 60 units of nitrogen and wait till the first frost and then start to graze it, right?
Yeah.
And also on the stockpile, that is one of the things we have been discussing here is if you can use a electric fence, right, to
Yes.
help them to go more like in a straight graze thing. That things help a lot.
It helps a lot. It really helps you to meter it out on a daily basis, just like you would feed hay. What I always tell folks to do is to start on the end where your water source is, right?
Mhm.
And then you strip off maybe 2 or 3 days worth of feed, or if it has to be a week, you can do a week, but 2 or 3 days worth of feed. With tread and post, it's usually fairly easy to just move that back a few feet, just enough to be able to go across that field and kind of like a front moving across the field. So,
Yeah.
like a football team,
That's right. A little bit at a time. Yeah. Yeah. And I love that as we're talking about these concepts, we've already tied in soil pH and soil testing, which we can talk about next, and then rotational grazing or managed grazing. And so let's jump into the soil health part and
Yep.
talk a little bit about soil testing and correcting pH.
Well, I'm glad that we talk about those together because really, soil pH is the beginning of soil health, in my opinion. Having good soil pH allows for the biological activity and the nutrient availability to occur. The thing that folks don't realize oftentimes is that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are all very influenced. The availability to the plant is very influenced by pH. And when you really stop and think about the cost of that, what you're losing, if you can put all the fertilizer out there in the world and spend a tremendous amount of money on fertilizer, but if your soil pH isn't where it needs to be, you're only going to get maybe 60% of the value out of that.
And most of the soil tests we have been receiving here, I like to highlight this. We are on the upper fours or in the low fives,
Mm.
right?
Yes.
So 4.8, 4.9, 5.2. That's very common for us here.
Yeah, it's very common across all of the Southeast, mainly because we are dealing with very naturally acidic soils to begin with. And we use a lot of nitrogen with not a lot of anything else.
Sure.
And that's one of the big challenges is that every unit of nitrogen we throw out there actually brings the pH down a certain level. And basically the old rule of thumb is, somewhere around every 10 pounds of nitrogen you got to put on a ton, or excuse me, for every 100 pounds of nitrogen you put out there, it takes about 10 pounds of lime eventually to go back and fix that acidity. So it really is job number one when it comes to nutrient availability. Especially for nitrogen, because nitrogen is the one that's probably the most sensitive to where that soil pH is at. But
would you agree that the soil pH target will be above 6.5?
yeah, that sweet spot is in kind of around 6.2, 6.3. If you can get it above 6, that's where you're really going to ensure nutrient availability kind of across the board. It's when you are dropping below, particularly below about 5.5, you really have some challenges in nutrient availability in those types of soils. And not only that, your microbes that are active in those soils really have a tremendous challenge of actually being able to cycle through those nutrients and mineralize those nutrients and make them available to the plant.
And how long does it take? I know it takes a while to correct that pH, right? And so you can't stop what you're doing from the time you start correcting it until you get maybe to that ideal or closer to that ideal. So how do you balance correcting pH, but also continuing using that forage throughout time?
Yeah, that's a great question because you can't do it overnight, as you well know. It's something that is a process. That pH didn't get that low overnight, and you're certainly not going to correct it overnight either. And it's one of those things you have to continue to do alongside your other management. Of course, it does depend on the quality of the lime that you're using, and actually, there's a tremendous amount of variation from one quarry to the next.
Yes.
And number one thing that's different is the coarseness of the material that you're putting out there. If it's not much bigger than, if it's around the size of sand, it's going to take a long time for it to really be available. If it's powdery, of course, that's going to pose some challenges for spread. But the finer material really will help a lot in terms of neutralizing that pH of the soil in a faster time frame.
And that's one of the points I have been discussing here as well, Dennis, because when you get your soil test report, they used to report an amount of lime you need based on a such average.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Here in Tennessee, I think the number is 65 ECC, something like this. So if you are buying a lime that does not have the quality to do that, and I remember when I was in Kansas, I was using one lime once from Missouri, and that thing was 92% ECC. So
yeah,
it can vary a lot.
It can vary a lot, and often you get what you pay for too with those. I remember a lot of the times when I was a county extension agent, I would correct in my county. I actually had two different sources of lime. One was always mad at me because they always, was a little bit lower grade, and we corrected the soil test recommendations on the basis of CCE, excuse me, the
CEC,
the calcium carbonate equivalent. And basically that's what standardizes lime. Every month I would get a report back in those days from actually it included all the lime quarries in the state of Kentucky when I was county agent, and you look to see where it was coming from, and you could correct it. So, but yeah, there's an assumption that it's usually about 2/3, about 67%, 67% calcium carbonate.
So good. We talk a little bit about extending grazing season, stockpile. the importance of the soil. I'm a soil fan here. I'm always talking about soil because that's the base of the system, right?
Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely.
where we are growing the plants. I cannot talk about livestock, dairy, or beef, whatever, without talking about soil first.
Yeah.
But then you mentioned also rotational stock, right? So we grew the forage. We have the ability to use it. You mentioned this as one of your top 3 practices that pay for.
Yeah.
What is the importance of use well the forage you produce?
Well, it's interesting because out of the respondents, over 46% of the folks that responded indicated that was certainly in their top 5 of things. And I made myself a note here. It was number 1 out of 32 by far with the producers. So they definitely are in favor of that. You know, fundamentally, it gets down to your thought process about being a livestock producer. Okay, are you considering yourself your production unit?
Mm-hmm.
Is that production unit a cow,
mm-hmm.
or is it an acre?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I'm of the opinion that your production unit really is an acre. You're trying to return the greatest amount of return on your investment per acre as you possibly can. And those that have really adopted this mentality of grazing management recognize the value of placing that your factory floor is, you know,
Sure.
your acre of land. So that's an important mindset to how we operate. We want to maximize that profit per acre. Certainly, the research has over time. Actually, the research on stockpile, or excuse me, on rotational stocking is a bit mixed.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is that a lot of those grazing trials would attempt to overgraze. And I think one of the biggest things that of anything that I can talk with folks about is to not overgraze.
Mm-hmm.
If you're continuously stocking or rotational stocking, the key is to not overgraze.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on continuous stocking, it's very easy to overgraze. On rotational stocking, you can still overgraze, but you if you're doing a good job of rotating your pastures, it's less of a challenge in doing so.
And if you need to overgraze and you can move, then you can give a better rest to that pasture, right?
That's exactly right.
Rest, yeah.
That's exactly right. And the other thing to remember is, especially with increasing droughts and the length of those droughts, is that the you know, when we go out there and the pasture has been grazed down to an inch or 2, the roots mirror a lot of that inch or 2. I mean, those roots rarely will go below an inch or 2, maybe 6. That's about it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you've got a good rest built in, that forage has a chance to rebuild the root system.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most popular things that I used to do for grazing programs is we would grow root tubes, and students would come in and I would have them go in and clip certain plants to, it was in big PVC pipes basically. And they would go in and clip those plants down to 2 inches every other day or something like that. Then I had some that they would do that maybe once every week. And then I had some that they would give it a 28-day rest in between clipping. So it would grow up almost like a hay cutting. And then you would clip it back off at 2 inches. And then if we did that for, you know, a few weeks, we'd then take it to
Grazing
one of our grazing schools or one of our programs, and then we would pull the whole plant, roots and all, out of this PVC and you know, wash off the roots, and you could just see the difference in the rooting zone of those plants. It makes it so much more resilient in the face of dry weather. So it's crucial.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I talk about a lot with my students, I teach the beef management class, and we do some of the, you know, pasture walk and things like that. But I give them these foundational science informed concepts, and then I talk about the art of grazing management and how we use that to help us make decisions. We use the science to help us make decisions, but the art is learning your system, figuring out what works, and learning to read your pasture and read your cattle or your livestock. And so the question inevitably is always, well, how many times how many pastures do I need, or how often do I rotate? And so can you talk a little bit about, is there an ideal system of rotational grazing, or does it really depend on your farm?
Well, it depends on your farm. It depends on the management that they have to put toward it as well. Of course, if you have one large pasture, the first step is to split that into two.
Cut it in half. Yep.
And then the second step is to split it again.
Mhm.
And then the third step is to split it again.
Mhm.
As a general rule of thumb, I don't know that there's a perfect, but what I would say is that the most successful folks that I have seen that are, doing this, they're serious about it, but they're also oftentimes working off farm. They don't have the time to do this every
Yeah.
day.
Sure.
There are a lot of folks that move, 2 or 3 times a day.
Mhm.
I mean, that's intense, but, I would be happy if we could find that happy medium about 9 paddocks. 9 paddocks allows you to spend about 3 or 4 days in each of those paddocks, and then by the time you get back around, you usually have about 30 days worth of rest that you've been able to give to them. That's kind of the sweet spot. And then if you need to take one of those out of the rotation to go faster, or if you need to slow down, you have some flexibility there to be able to do it. And that's usually what the graduates of my grazing school when I was at Georgia, they went back and did that. They would say, yeah, that really worked well for me.
Yeah.
And I think one of the points is when we talk about these things, we all have this bunch of squares in these slides, right? Because it's easy to put in a slide, but I've been discussing it with farmers as well. You don't need to have your farm always square. We're in Tennessee, right?
Yeah.
We're in the
Yeah,
middle
yeah.
of the hills here. Hills are everywhere. So they got to find a way to do this in a way that works for them, right?
Right. Yeah, it's funny because I've helped actually look at aerial maps and draw it out. And sometimes when you step back and look at it, it looks like some abstract art,
Yeah, yeah.
one of those ink blot tests that you're trying to test their sanity or whatnot. But it's one of those that you have to adapt it to your production and your factory floor, right? And not all areas of that factory floor are going to be equally conducive to production in the same way. If you've got 4 acres of bottom ground, and then you've got 9 acres running along a ridge somewhere, that 4 acres of bottom ground may actually outproduce the 9 acres that's on that ridge. So
That's true.
you have to really adapt to the productivity of that site. In some senses, it's precision ag for forage management.
I like to think like this.
We talk about precision livestock management, and I'm like, man, soil testing to get that nutrient precise and moving cattle, these are precision livestock technologies that we can use. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Out of the things that I love the most about the rotational stocking is that you can play much more, right? I used to say that we now are in charge of the grazing part of this, not the cows anymore.
Yes.
So if you want to be there for 3 days, fine. If you have too much forage, you may be there for 4 or 5. Right. If it's in a drought situation, maybe you need to run in a day and a half and move forward. And even if you have 90 paddocks, as you mentioned, and you have a lot of forage, you can cut it.
Yep.
Or stockpile in the fall. So it brings to you the ability to make much more advised decisions, right?
Absolutely. And you make the cows or whatever livestock, you make them work for you.
That's right. Yeah.
You are in charge now.
They are to do what you are to, what you're trying to accomplish there. And one of the other big things, and we haven't really talked about this, but one of the big things about stocking or rotational stocking like that is that you're distributing much more of the
nutrients. Yeah.
And when I was growing up, we had 1 or 2 large pastures, and we just turned the gates, opened up the gates and let them have at it. And inevitably, they would just concentrate in certain areas. Of course, the shady areas, or where the water trough is, or where watering hole is. And then you end up with just huge amounts of nutrient concentration there. And with fertilizer prices the way they are, we cannot afford to have one little area of the field being sky high in phosphorus and potassium, and the other parts of the field being, robbed of it, because you have these cows that are grazing an area the size of this room, and then they're depositing it in about the size of a pie shape, you know.
Mm.
It's concentrating those nutrients and moving those nutrients to places that aren't going to be productive. Was with rotational grazing, rotational stocking, and returning it more distributed across the whole pasture. That makes a huge difference.
Yeah, one of my favorite times to make that point is at a field day when we're standing out, you know, in the summer and we're all inevitably under the shade.
Mhm.
And I'm like, look at us.
Yeah.
We're standing in the shade because it's comfortable here, right? And so cattle are going to do the same thing unless we kind of encourage them to use that whole area. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And they're herd animals. I mean,
That's right. They're gonna
it's
move-
their
move
nature
together.
to do
Yeah.
that, like kindergartners.
Yeah.
You can't send one kindergartner to the water trough.
That's
water
right.
fountain.
They
You
all
gotta
need
send
to
them
go.
all.
No, that's amazing. Well, Dennis, thank you so much for joining us for, you know, to on our livestock podcast here. Katie, any final comment, any final questions to Dr.
No, I
Hancock?
think we could certainly talk, you know, all day
Oh,
about
gosh.
this, but really just kind of wrapping this up, thinking about how all these things work together, right? We tried to separate out these practices, but we talked about each one within the other one because the system all works together. And like you
System
said, it
all.
starts with the soil and then the forage and then there's the return of nutrients. So I really, you know, I love that part. I want to recognize that they all kind of work together. So
Yeah, it's definitely a network. They all feed together, and one management change affects the others. So
yeah.
Awesome. That's great conversation. Thank you so much for being here with us again. Thanks you all for joining us for this livestock podcast episode again, sponsored by the University of Tennessee Beef and Forage Center. We hope everyone tunes in the next month for another great conversation on beef and forage. Thank you all.